childhood trauma often occurs when we have this critical stage of development. Experiences like neglect, abuse, inconsistent caregiving, as well as more intense experiences like war or famine, it really impacts how the child then views the world and their place in it. And I did mention this a little bit just before around the beliefs we then have. We create beliefs about ourselves, about others, and about the world. So based on those early life experiences, that then gets created as the narrative we then live by. The nervous system then becomes hardwired to operate in what we know as the survival mode. The body's fight, flight, or freeze responses may actually become overactive, creating long-term patterns of hypervigilance, distrust, or emotional dysregulation. And that's just in childhood.
So I feel like a good starting point would be to go through what is trauma.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Trauma trauma is a really tricky thing to try and describe in just one sentence, so please bear with me. Trauma is any event or series of events that overwhelm an individual's ability to cope, leaving a really profound and lasting impact on their emotional, psychological, and even physical well-being. I often describe trauma as existing on a spectrum, with experiences ranging from universally recognized as life-altering to something that's a little bit more subtle, more culminative events that may not even register as trauma for a person experiencing them. One of the most common issues I see in my work is how people invalidate and minimize their own experiences of trauma when they perceive them as being lower on the spectrum. They might say it wasn't that bad, or other people may have had it so much worse than me, as though their pain doesn't deserve attention or healing because it doesn't fit the traditional narrative of what trauma is. This tendency I find to discount this impact of one's own experiences is not only harmful, but also delays the actual healing process, which I think is so important for us to highlight in today's discussion. Trauma isn't about comparison, it's about how an event or series of events impacts someone, our mind, our body, and our sense of safety in the world. It's deeply personal and valid, regardless of where it actually sits on that spectrum.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that as well later in the conversation around the healing journey. Is it worthwhile differentiating between, I guess, the more acute, chronic, and complex types, and maybe going into how those are different when it comes to PTSD or trauma, rather?
Oh, oh, yes. So I think that's a great question. I think when we look at trauma, we need to be differentiating between a one event type of impact and then multiple events, and I think that's where it gets a little bit challenging to explore and discuss. So to better understand trauma and how it then eventuates into resulting in things like PTSD symptoms or complex PTSD symptoms, we do need to start to differentiate things that help us understand on a deeper level the differences that trauma actually is. And on one hand, we've got what is known as a big T trauma. I know in some research and practitioners do categorize trauma in that way, which is very commonly associated with diagnoses like PTSD. So these are events that we traditionally associate, that's quite widely accepted. Things like abuse, war, accidents, natural disasters, life-threatening situations. Like you mentioned, Luke, they're quite acute, they're significant. They often involve a very clear and immediate threat to our own safety. What research is coming out more and more in the context of is what is known as little t trauma. These experiences are subtle, but no less harmful to the individual that experiences them, and might also still result in symptoms or a diagnosis of PTSD or complex PTSD. They include events like chronic criticism, emotional neglect, bullying, or feeling unseen and unsupported, particularly during formative years in our development. Little t trauma or traumas might not seem significant to outsiders or even to the person experiencing them, but their culminative effect can profoundly shape an individual's emotional or psychological well-being.
What is the context in which you usually discover these little t traumas? An example that I feel might be relevant, and perhaps you can either tell me this is maybe this is not accurate or it is accurate. Would it be when someone maybe says, and this is just from speaking to people and observing and being attentive to how people respond to certain things, when you mention something and it could just be in a conversation, they're like, "Oh no, it's all good. I'm fine with that." Like, "Oh, that happened to me in the past. It's all good." What they say, it makes you stronger, kind of thing. Is that in practice as a clinician and when you're dealing with these appearances, is that in what context usually appears? Something like that where they kind of disregard it? Or is that also, can that just be anything when someone's not really looking at the deeper things going on?
It can actually swing both ways. On one hand, you could have individuals that are minimizing it because they have grown up or been exposed to that, this toughen up attitude that we at times fall into the trap of. They might have seen how people are treated if they are vulnerable and open about their suffering or issues. There's so many facets why someone might minimize it. They might not believe that their trauma is big enough to call it trauma. And also, then there's the lack of education that we find in certain individuals, that not just the person who has experienced the trauma, but who they have in their environment. If they're naturally going to be minimizing any emotional outburst or any emotional neglect or any suffering, the individual that has the trauma would then minimize it within themselves as a coping mechanism or a safety mechanism. Because if they already believe that they're not going to be believed, or they're not going to be accepted, or they're going to be abused or harmed in a way for expressing truly what is going on for them, then why would anyone share that? On the other side of the spectrum is people who associate stress or anxiety as trauma. And I can definitely talk in a lot more depth about that a little bit later when we talk about misconceptions and misdefinitions, because we very much over amplify that. Oh, that was so traumatic for me, when it may have been stressful and it definitely may have been impactful, but does it then fall within the parameters of what we see as traumatic? It may not. And it's not to invalidate people's struggle or experiences, but we don't want to overuse the term in a way where individuals who have actually suffered with significant trauma feel like the word has just been bled into every experience of any discomfort.
So, a good place to start around the misconceptions of trauma, maybe let's define the difference between trauma, stress, anxiety, and other mental health presentations.
Absolutely. And I think, there's definitely the misconceptions we can talk about in a moment, but the scope and misdefinitions I think is really important here to acknowledge. As I mentioned, trauma exists on a spectrum. While it's often associated with explicit, identifiable events like a car accident, natural disaster, or a personal loss, it can also be deeply rooted in more subtle, pervasive experiences. So, for instance, intergenerational trauma is passed down through families, often manifesting in ways that individuals just may not be able to immediately recognize that it is linked to past events. We've got systematic and cultural traumas, racial discrimination, social oppression, and all of this naturally then forms into what we then experience as trauma as a whole. When we have this common tendency to mislabel emotions, emotional experiences such as stress or burnout or anxiety as trauma, that's where we do find ourselves really, really stuck in misidentifying what trauma truly is for the experienced, for the person who is experiencing the trauma itself. And while these experiences of these emotions are undeniably valid struggles and often share overlapping symptoms, they are very distinct from the unresolved, deep rooted pain that defines trauma. And that's the distinction. Stress and anxiety typically involve a heightened, but this is the key word, temporary activation of the nervous system. For example, people who experience stress and anxiety, it might stem from work deadlines, financial worries, or personal conflict. And once these triggers are addressed or removed, the nervous system often returns back to what we call a baseline functioning. Trauma, however, is marked by the inability to fully process or integrate an overwhelming event or series of events, leaving the individual stuck in a state of hyperarousal, the fight and flight, or hypoarousal, which is the freeze or shutdown experience. So when we look at some of the literature that is out there, one of my favorites is research and resources from Bessel van der Kolk, where he writes, "The body keeps the score." He really defines trauma as it comprises the brain area that actually communicates the physical embodied feeling of being alive. Like, this is what actually is the distinction that underscores what trauma actually is. It's not just about the emotional distress, it's also about the whole body experience that affects how we feel, how we think, and even our connection to the world. So, to further maybe complicate the conversation, our society sometimes uses the term trauma really loosely, applying it, like I mentioned before, to everyday struggles like a bad day at work or a tough breakup. And like I mentioned, while these experiences can certainly be difficult, misusing the term risks diluting its meaning, potentially invalidating those who have navigated profound and enduring impacts of genuine trauma. So when we try and understand trauma as a spectrum, one that encompasses both explicit events and systematic or cultural influences, we can actually create a space to validate a wider range of experiences while also maintaining clarity about what trauma truly entails. This clarity does not only foster deeper empathy, but it also ensures that individuals receive the appropriate support and interventions of their unique struggles.
One of the really interesting things that I read about trauma, it was about 2 years ago, was around the genes associated with trauma. And
Mm,
I've just pulled up here, it's the FKBP5 gene. And what was really interesting to me is not so much looking at, how one might be influenced by the threshold being decreased for how someone can experience a situation and how it can impact them as far as sensitivity, but even how it can pass on from generations. So the question I always had,
mm,
because I hear it so much in spiritual circles, is around intergenerational trauma, and people use the term very loosely. At least that was my experience of it. So I started doing some research into it, and there's articles out there that talk about how when a parent goes through a traumatic experience, and most likely this is what the article, that what I got from the article, from the scientific article, was that the traumatic events of the father are most likely passed through to the child, and not as in the specific experience, but the decreased tolerance
mm,
towards traumatic events, meaning that their
mhm,
threshold is decreased. So how someone's parents what someone's parents went through can impact the child's, and also as they get older, their level of tolerance for traumatic events, meaning that what won't affect someone else might affect someone else. Has that been your experience as well when you're dealing with presentations of or versions of trauma, that some individuals are more inclined to be impacted by what others perceive to be smaller things?
It's a very good question. And again, I'm being very selective in how I try and explain this because everyone has experienced some form of trauma. And when we can see that, if I have a client in my session and they tell me about their struggles, or sometimes clients tell me that they feel like everything went beautifully well for them. And one segment of my assessment process is to also go a little bit deeper in trying to ascertain what was also occurring for your parents and your grandparents and what did they go through, because it does help me add a little piece to the puzzle to understand the individual that's sitting in front of me when they are trying to discuss some of the struggles or challenges that they're going through. So when we actually look, and I love that there's so much research now coming out in, and has always been there, I think it's now just coming to the forefront of our discussions, which I love. It's highlighting that what our parents went through and what our grandparents went through, it does get pulled through when the genetics kind of to then make up the individual that's then sitting on my couch, or even me as an individual, from my parents and their parents. And I think there is definitely, it shows up in a way where, if and I guess I can kind of digress here a little bit, but still on the topic, when I have clients who have had parents with very complex trauma in their life, most of them have their own struggles in their own view of the world, their safety of the world, because just because a parent's or grandparent's trauma may not be happening at the time that my client is alive, the way that my clients, let's say parents or grandparents, even cope at the time my client is alive and associated with them would then impact them, which then also then makes them more susceptible in their own temperament through the genetic line of how they then view the world and how resilient they are in their own temperament in handling challenges that they then get faced in their timeline or lifetime.
It's very interesting. I was doing neurofeedback back in 2019 and I did the QEEG and the results came back and a part of my I guess neurological makeup, if you want to call it that, or just a scan showed high levels of rumination. They have the green and the yellow, then the red. Red is high activity, and then green is average or low activity. And I remember seeing this, and it was really red for rumination. And I was speaking to the individual there, and as we all do in life, we go through mini realizations. He said to me, I go, oh, interesting. So this is how I usually, when an event happens in my life, like I think about it very deeply and I reflect on it, like this happened or that happened, and I'm very sensitive to things that happen. I'm looking at like, oh, what did I do here? Where am I not taking responsibility? Where is this person doing this? And I really like try and take ownership for it. And I asked him, I said, so is this normal? Like, what do you usually see? And he goes, no, like it's some people, an event happens, and in the space of a couple of minutes after that, they forget about it and they move
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
And which is so obvious. And like I knew that obviously people are different, but in my mind, I had this, I guess, experience of like, oh wow, like that's uniquely me, and there's
Mm.
drawbacks and there's benefits to it. But it helped me really realize that someone's experience of an event or a situation is massively different to what mine is. And again, like it's very obvious. We all know that. We all know we're individuals are different. But just on that level, it really fascinated me, and it really ties in, I feel, to when someone experiences an event and they go through what we deem to be like, oh, just like, it's fine, just move on. It's completely different for someone else.
Hmm. Absolutely, I agree with that, Luke. When I do my assessment with a client, like I explained, I try and collect all the puzzle pieces for me to understand their framework, not just, their thinking, but um, all aspects of the whole body and how it then shows up in the world that they live in. Um, I also then start to teach my clients, and I think education is such a big thing before we can go, and we'll talk about this. The first step of even roadmap to healing from trauma is building awareness. You can't build awareness if you don't have education behind it to be able to build that awareness, to understand what it is you need to build awareness on. But when I try and explain to a client what makes them up and why they are the way that they are, to kind of Now that I've collected all the puzzle pieces, I kind of help them see all the puzzle pieces as well, because it's really easy because I'm trained to be able to understand and connect them all and really get a clear picture of my client. It is then my role, and I'm so honored to have that role with the individuals that choose to work with me, to then provide that to my clients and explain that there is a genetic line, and this is what, what fuels then what's part of your core. There's your own temperament, and you could have a sibling in the same upbringing, same parents, same environment, and you both will be seeing the situation in completely different ways. And then there's also the early life experiences that influence that, and how our, not just basic needs, but how our core emotional needs get met in those early life stages. And it's not just 0 to 5, it's 0 till right up until this moment. How are those core emotional needs being met? And if we're constantly not getting those core emotional needs met, we don't think that they need to be asked for, so we shelve them. And therefore, that then perpetuates more and more of that experience where trauma can easily happen. You pair that with genetics and you pair that with our temperament. All of that is a big picture as to why then aspects of our cause start to then get influenced and can then look like either little trauma or big trauma when we look at the little t, big T trauma spectrum.
The beautiful thing for me, and the also just fascinating thing, is how much people benefit from encouragement and actually just being heard.
Mm.
And I mean, this is just me, someone who speaks to people and talks to people and tries to hold space where I can as a person, from person to person. But as a clinician, I know this is slightly off topic. How much does that, I mean, how much would that drain you, but also how much would that reward you? Just being able to hold space for someone and just and seeing someone let go, like we
Mm.
call it the armoring. The armoring is slowly being taken off, and just the responsibility of that. It must be hard, first and foremost, when you have your rough days, as any person would, but also encouraging just to see this, the light side against the dark of humanity in a way. I'd love
Mm.
to hear more about that just briefly, if you're willing to share.
Of course. In my early career, I feel my clients' disclosures weighed a lot more heavier on me outside of the session than they do these days. I, being someone in my field, I care and I'm empathic and I take that on. I wouldn't be doing what I do if I didn't have those characteristics. But as a byproduct, in your early career, before you're able to develop a strong capacity to hold that and leave it, it was definitely draining. It was really hard. There were times I would go home to now my husband and I would cry. He obviously couldn't know why exactly because of confidentiality, but very much it weighed very heavily on you because so, when you think you heard the worst that you could hear, you hear something else that shocks you, that rattles you to your core. And as a clinician, holding that for somebody and ensuring that the session isn't about you, it's about them, takes skill, takes time, takes practice. And I think while I definitely don't want to minimize the amazing connection someone would have with a early career psychologist, that's why going to seasoned psychologist is very, very safe, because the way that you're able to hold someone's disclosures, no matter how dark, no matter how intense, because you have been able to build your own capacity to hear without shock in the room. While you definitely want to be authentic in the room, like I mentioned, you don't want to make the experience about yourself. You want the experience to be about the client in their expression of trauma. When we do trauma work, and honestly, over the years, I thought I was trauma informed in my early career, and as you continue your work in it, you become more and more and realize I'm never done. You know, I think it's great to know, okay, I am trauma informed, but I'm definitely not done. And the moment you think that, you need to very much have a big reflective piece on why you think that, and keep really being humble to be able to step into that space for someone in a really respectful and kind, nurturing manner. The work that we do, though, is extremely enlightening. I feel very humbled, and very honored to be able to hold a space for my clients who choose me to disclose to. They don't need to. And when someone feels safe enough and not threatened, and be able to step into that level of vulnerability, and it's different when you trauma dump on someone versus actually step into the trauma and want to be healed. And that is, like I mentioned, it's the biggest honor to be on someone's healing journey with them. And now that I've been in the industry for 20 years, I've been a psychologist for 15, it's definitely something that I'm able to sit in really comfortably in. I don't have my notes with me. I don't need to check anything. Everything is just authentic, and it flows based on the years of experience. And my clients have been my teachers. Yes, I've attended copious amounts of professional development training and did my courses, but the biggest teachers in being able to sit in that space is taking guidance from my clients, and that is the most rewarding work. And when we work with trauma, we can be working with one client for years. And that's on a regular basis, because we cannot rush trauma. Some clients are able to work through it really gracefully, and I don't want to say quickly, but within a shorter amount of time, where others are 5 years on, and it's not because you want them stuck in therapy. As a therapist, you're there for periods of their life, but depending on what type of trauma that they have experienced, it does take time to unpack and to work through. And to be given that is the most rewarding experience. And seeing them grow, and seeing them set boundaries, and seeing them be able to downregulate themselves, or notice, how do I say this? Notice things in their environment that they shy away from because it's not good for them. And then they come to you telling you that, to be part of that with them, it is the greatest honor I have ever experienced in my life. So it is something that still is really challenging on one hand, because there's still a sadness and like a heartbreak that comes with what people experience when they share their traumas. And also, it also is paired with the opportunity to create healing for them. And that, I can't explain that. That's just beautiful.
So I wanted to the question that's come out for me throughout that, and just really tuning into, because we have a structure that we want to go through.
Mm.
But a question that's coming up for me that I really love to ask is, what is being a clinician, and specifically a psychologist dealing with, I'm sure, a diverse range of individuals, what has it taught you about human nature, the good and the bad?
That's a loaded question. Let's see how I can. That's a great question. It has taught me that we are stronger than we give ourselves credit for. That that things in the it's the yin and yang of the world, right? It's being able to acknowledge that our existence in this human experience is both the light and the dark, and one can't exist without the other. And sometimes, without invalidating people's experiences, and at a certain point in their healing journey, we very much look at what why certain things happened and what we were able to achieve from them. So it helps then even the individual be able to change their perception about the world that they live in, because yes, it's so easy when we, even as a clinician, when we hear these stories, or there are individuals that have experienced these traumas, there is a very quick bias that we get into, that people are bad, people are hurtful, people are horrific, abusive, I can't trust anyone. the world is unsafe, or even beliefs that I'm defective, I deserve it. We can very much get ingrained in that, and many of us do. What has it taught me? It's that we will all be traumatized in some way by someone on some level of that, on that spectrum. And I think the world has started to really be able to name that that's not okay, to be able to help each other work through traumas and be able to heal, not just one on one, but as a collective. And irrespective of there being abuse or war or issues or negativity in the world or bad people in the world, there will always be the contrast to that. And in my role as a clinician, I try, even just one on one in my therapy space, to be the one on the side that is going to be the one that's on the healing side. And if I can prove that to at least my clients and get them to at least create a trustworthy relationship within the therapeutic space and be a beacon or a model of them to see what a healthy relationship is supposed to look like and how they are supposed to be treated with respect, with kindness, then they then can find that in the communities that they do live in because it exists.
I think one of the challenges, and this is just my experience speaking to psychologists, clinicians, and individuals who in the helping people space, one of the, I guess, unspoken challenges, or maybe rather unobserved things from the person who is receiving the therapy, is how difficult I imagine it must be to not make it personal, to avoid things like countertransference and transference and things like that. So I guess on that note, how do you deal with, and it could be more broader, you don't have to use being a psychologist as an example. I know we're massively off topic. I feel like this is a really important question. How do you deal with resentment? And it could be, just in your life, what you've learned from being a clinician, but resentment, because sometimes you might be offering therapy or providing therapy to someone that you just fundamentally don't agree with them. You fundamentally just don't have the same worldview, but you see that there's something that you want to help them with, and it's part of your duty to do that. How do you deal with, I guess, that dissonance, the resentment, and those feelings, personally, but also as a clinician? And I guess how can we then use that as viewers and listeners and people that maybe aren't so skilled at those things?
And just to confirm, that resentment is there because I'm seeing a discrepancy between mine and the client's worldviews.
It could be that, and it could also, yes, yes, it's that.
Okay. I think in my early career, I would probably try and be the best clinician that I possibly can be and still try and give the client and make it all about the client to be like, no, they need me. I don't matter. I'll just do my best ethically within the parameters because I know I can provide them with something. And I'd obviously take it to supervision because as clinicians, we do have to have regular supervision. So I'd be guided by my supervisor if I were having any issues with that. It was a period there where I would, I guess, discount my own feelings in what I'm noticing in the room. As a clinician grows and is able to then, whether personally or professionally, able to admit things about what they might be doing in the therapeutic space, it later on in my career, when something like that happens, you notice the feelings in you, and in the moment you do and name it as transference or countertransference, you're very quick at being able to understand why that might be triggered in me, or I would very quickly understand why that would be a bother for me. I would name the emotion for myself. Depending on the relationship I have with the client and the rapport I have with the client, I might very, very gently be able to share what's coming up for me in a very therapeutic way to ensure that the client is just a little bit aware, but again, not making it personal, but just noticing the emotions that are building in the space if it is appropriate. But if I'm noticing that it's not going to be helpful for me to be the best version of myself in the therapy space, the client deserves a clinician that they, align with. And there have been clients where I have had those discussions to say that I might not be the right fit for them. And at first in my early career, I was so scared because I would see that as a failure. I would see that I'm doing the wrong thing by the client. Whereas I have learned over the many years that to be honest and to be truthful to the client, if it's something that you can see will impact your capacity to be the best clinician for the client, as well as the best version of yourself for yourself, then this isn't a good fit for either of you. And sometimes, if this is something that we're talking from a clinician point of view, just like clients have the right to choose what clinician they see, clinicians also have a right to choose what clients they see as well, because that then allows a really beautiful, supportive, and nurturing environment for things like the treatment of trauma to occur in a space where it's not jarring for either individual, the clinician or the client.
And so I want to jump back onto the trauma topic shortly, bit of a detour there. But last question on that is, how does that apply to, so the principles that you've learned from, let's go with resentment, for example, but feel free to share any topic around this. How is that transferred into life? I don't mean specific examples, share what you want to share, but I mean, is there principles or ways of being that you've taken from, from therapy and providing therapy to someone else, and then apply it to life? And is there something that we can learn as individuals who aren't therapists around that?
You mean about being stuck on emotions that are really hard to shift?
Yeah, it could be that. It could also be dealing with resentment towards someone. It could be in a relationship. We all know in relationships, and when two will come together, there's resentment sometimes, and moving through that can be quite difficult. So I guess using any of those examples, lessons or applications that one might follow around
Mm.
resentment. Let's go with that.
Mm. And I'm happy to share more of a personal answer in this.
Sure.
I often believe if I'm feeling an emotion because of someone, or something, it is triggering something in me that I have not healed. And so sitting down and using journaling as a reflective practice allows me to ascertain, why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling about this? What am I doing that is resulting in them treating me this way or this environment the way that it is? What am I not doing? Because inaction is also something that is impactful to how we might feel about something. I think when we do and we talk about, I guess when we go back to talking about healing from trauma, building our awareness and understanding about why I feel this way, is super important. And I think sometimes that's step number one. If you genuinely sit down and try and reflect and don't know why, don't get stuck on the why. Focus on the what. Emotions, no matter what emotion it is, resentment, anger, jealousy, love, happiness, anxiety, they are all emotions that are your check engine light. If you are able to tap into and truly understand the emotion that's there that you are suffering with, you are already on a path to be able to understand, well, what is it trying to tell me that I need? Emotions give you the pathway to get your needs fulfilled. And with something like resentment, it's part of the angry, I guess, umbrella, right? I feel angry, I feel resentful, I feel funny. I was actually talking about resentment with one of my clients yesterday, but it's where we might not feel like we've been able to express. There's been an injustice. We feel like someone is using us, or that there's a level of something feels unfair, and the resentment then builds because we're not, or something's preventing us from being able to get our needs met. And that then is brewing in someone as an emotional response to get us to act. it really then comes down to an individual in being able to be aware of, are they going to act in their coping mechanisms? And sometimes that's avoidance, sometimes that's people pleasing, sometimes it's overcompensation. Or are we actually going to take a moment and really, really ascertain why am I being resentful, and then potentially creating a pathway to move through this emotion, whether it be in a mindful way, whether it be in low intensity practices like, mindful breathing, or talking it out with somebody that you trust, or physically getting out of the body, or actually then going into some problem solving mechanisms to be able to resolve the issue that is then causing resentment. So I guess that's an example of one way. And I think when we are able to ask ourselves, it's coming up for a reason, and I need to listen to this emotion. If you give yourself the space to listen to that emotion, you'll be able to understand yourself on such a deeper level, so that when these emotions come up, they don't completely derail you. You're actually wanting these emotions to come up for you to be able to again create the life that you want to live, whether that is through having conversations with people, whether that's changing your workplace because it no longer serves you, establishing boundaries with people that don't respect you. It can really lead into some changes for yourself, that then help create, like I said, that sense of contentment with the life that you're wanting to live.
Yeah, and my observation from what you said then is it's about approaching a situation as opposed to reaction. And maybe there
Mm.
is reaction initially, but the the pathway you're trying to follow there is proactivity, meaning that
Mm.
I'm feeling XYZ emotion. Let's address that by either speaking to a psych or writing it out, journaling it, understanding it, being mindful with it, and taking the time to let it flow as opposed to, how would you put it, being controlled by it and letting it define your decisions, because we all have, ways of being, whether optimal or not so optimal, that
Mm.
impact how we show up. And an example of this could be the attachment style of things, of avoidant and anxious and so
Mm.
on and so on. And actually, speaking of which, a nice segue into the trauma side of things, and anxious and avoidant and things like that.
Mm.
Perhaps with that in mind, when we talk about trauma and the origins of it
Mm-hmm.
and childhood,
Mm-hmm.
how does trauma in childhood, I guess, differ from its impact later in life? So, someone who experiences something traumatic, it could be, war or something like that, versus childhood, and I guess maybe how it might develop in childhood, um, with the mind of a child.
It's a great question, because I guess that's where we all start, right? And how our needs, our core emotional needs, as well as our basic needs, get met in childhood does create a pathway of how we then cope with life overall. Childhood trauma often occurs when we have this critical stage of development. Experiences like neglect, abuse, inconsistent caregiving, as well as more intense experiences like war or famine. It really, really impacts how the child then views the world and their place in it. And I did mention this a little bit just before around the beliefs we then have. We create beliefs about ourselves, about others, and about the world. So, based on those early life experiences, that then gets created as the narrative we then live by. The nervous system then becomes hardwired to operate in what we know as the survival mode. The body's fight, flight, or freeze responses may actually become overactive, creating long term patterns of hypervigilance, distrust, or emotional dysregulation. And that's just in childhood.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And is it so when we're, this is my understanding of the childhood side of things, as a child, we're experiencing the world through a specific lens that isn't rational or logical. Meaning, if
Mm.
if my mom came up to me now and was acting strange and weird towards me, I would then say, okay, something's going with her. That's a bit odd, and I wouldn't see it as something that is. Again, this also could be because we rely on our primary caregiver or caregivers,
Mm.
and so we need to mold and bend to that to survive. But now I'd be like, okay, it's just weird. I can put a boundary in place, like I need space and whatever. so on and so on, or I can tell myself that's not normal behavior, right? Whereas a child, like if someone's treating you a certain way, the language or rather lack of language that you might use is it's about me. So
Mm,
I'm the center of the world as opposed to I'm a part of the world or of
mhm.
the world or coming through the world, so to speak, is the difference between what I would define as adult and childhood. Is that in alignment with what you believe as well, or is there some distinctions?
Absolutely. We very much are egocentric when we are children. You described it beautifully there, Luke. If mum is acting in that way, I have caused it. It's because of me. Even something as simple as a parent coming, like running late from work, has nothing to do with the child. The child internalizes that as mum doesn't want to see me. She hates spending time with me. I'm such a burden on them. Mum has more fun things to do than spend time with me. I'm such a horrible child. And
I'm not
that
good
then
enough.
and yes, absolutely. And for majority of us, there's the fight between whether we are or are not good enough, lovable, worthy, and so forth and so on. So, yeah, you're absolutely correct in describing that, Luke. We are egocentric when we are children, and that's why our perception of everything around us gets so skewed. And it is the responsibility of our caregivers to be able to help navigate our distress in those moments. And if our caregivers are able to redirect our distress, not redirect, sorry, downregulate our distress, and then redirect those narratives to a little bit of reassurance, that then creates a safety and security not only within our attachments but also then the world that we live in. If that is missing for whatever reason, and rightly so, I'm not here blaming parents in any way, and I say that to all of my clients. We are not here blaming anybody for doing the wrong thing as they're trying to bring up children. Sometimes parents are busy. Sometimes we just don't see the cues. Sometimes we just don't have the knowledge around that. People are doing the best that they can with what they have been taught. And you can be the most amazing parent and have read all the books. You still can't read your child's mind. And sometimes things can get missed. And that's not a bad thing. Or, it's just naturally what happens in our childhood.
And it's very interesting. I think there's a thread there to what you said before as well around journaling and just the
Mm,
process of journaling, which is to bring sometimes, and sometimes it's a reframe as well, but to bring what was unconscious to the conscious. And
yes.
when we have a reaction and we're so used to having that reaction, it's almost like it's a and then it's like how do I explain this in simple terms? You have an emotional reaction to something that maybe was from when you were younger, and then because as a human, as a person, we want to level out those feelings and to feel like we're uh, rational and normal. We then rationalize the response,
Mm,
and then it creates a cycle of emotion from the past. Something triggers it, I then rationalize it. Something triggers it, I rationalize it. Then it becomes a part of identity, and I feel like, and we can touch on this a bit later on as well, the journaling side of things and the therapeutic process. So self-therapeutic, which is the journaling, but then also seeing someone to talk to those things, it breaks that pattern. It creates a new pattern of, okay, here's the emotion. How do I want to respond to this? What is the frame through which I want to see the world? And who do I want to be in relation to this? And just sometimes, how can I understand this more?
mm.
And so I think to tie that into childhood and to the experience of trauma in childhood, would you classify it as an unconscious emotional reaction? Let's say, for example, you're someone who is a fearful avoidant, and for definition, fearful avoidant is someone blend of anxious and then also avoidant patterns because there was a experience in childhood that was, how would you say, sometimes avoidant, sometimes like I'm feeling abandoned. If someone in a relationship, then gets into a relationship and they're finding that they just emotionally shut down arguments or so on and so on, is that an example of trauma or is that an example of something completely different? I mean, we can use that example specifically or other ones as well.
Hmm. Look, I think if yes, if the example you're using, if the let's say that was a client in front of me coming to me and telling me that, if I know that in their history throughout childhood or adolescence, they had a lot of experiences where they, were clung on to and then abandoned. And then there's this constant, we're on again, off again type of relationship dynamic that gets created from parent caregivers or even friendships throughout school. If they come to me and then tell me that this is the reaction that I'm having in my in today, yeah, it might not necessarily be a trauma response in the moment, because a trauma response really depends on what is happening physiologically in their body as well as emotionally and cognitively. So if they're actually just mildly distressed at the fact that someone's, let's say, abandoning them now, and they think, they're bothered by that, it's not necessarily a trauma response in the moment. They have had trauma in the past, but it might not be fueling their current. They're just having a normal human response to something that is like uncomfortable. But if someone is coming to me and they're dysregulated, they're overly emotional, and they can't bear to be in their body because someone has, let's say, abandoned them, or even a perceived abandonment, that is a trauma response that they are then experiencing in the moment because of traumatic incidences that have also then happened throughout their lifetime.
Can you just run me through what the difference is between the healing journey from a, I guess, spiritual point of view, maybe someone in the spiritual community, let's go on the healing journey, they might say, and between, I guess, the clinical approach, and how they might coexist together?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And it's important for us to acknowledge that before we even get to that point, there are other steps we can talk about a little bit later. But to answer your question, both clinical and spiritual approaches have unique contributions to the healing journey, and they can actually really complement one another. So when we look at healing and a person already being at that stage of engaging in something clinical, spiritual, for themselves, it comes down to what feels right for you, right? So as we are going to be talking about healing and the roadmap, we need to attribute that every person's journey is going to be unique, and healing is going to be beautifully attuned to what you need at the time that you need it. So if we are to separate, I guess, clinical methods versus spiritual or somatic practices, with clinical methods, you engage with your typical therapeutic approaches with psychologists, counselors, mental health workers, where they take approaches that try and dive into the underlying reasons of why we are stuck in the trauma that we are experiencing. So techniques are derived from schema therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. The gold standard out there at the moment and for a very long time has been eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, so EMDR. They all address trauma from a neurological and cognitive perspective. And these therapies really help rewire the brain's responses to traumatic memories, reducing emotional charge and fostering new ways of thinking and behaving. We also see in the clinical sphere trauma-focused therapies, which actually focus on creating a sense of safety, helping clients process trauma in a really contained and safe way. Majority of clinicians out there can be trained with a variety of different modalities, and some can be eclectic, where they take the best of what they know and tailor it to a client's experience. Others, very much from start to finish, apply a specific therapy, like, for example, EMDR, from start to finish to then help the individual not only uh, understand their trauma and its impact on their everyday, but also then process and work through, so that level of dysfunction that trauma can bring in someone's life can actually be worked through. And what we then see through the application of such methodologies is a significant improvement in people's ability to cope and function, and also regulate their own nervous system should they be encountering any trigger points where previous to that therapy style they may have been dysregulated or overwhelmed by. If we are to then look at spiritual or somatic practices, this is where things that have been around for a very, very long time in Eastern practices, which have made their way slowly into Western practices, but the more we are really, really allowing both of these, the spiritual and the clinical, to bleed within one another. And we're seeing a lot more research supporting spiritual or somatic practices, the more we are then relying on those practices within the clinical framework as well. So practices like mindfulness, breath work, yoga, they all help reconnect the body and mind, offering tools for calming the nervous system and releasing the stored trauma that's in the body. And Bessel van der Kolk really highlights this in his book, Body Keeps the Score. And we want to get individuals to feel more connected with the body through these practices. There are energy healing modalities as well, such as Reiki or chakra balancing, which provide a different avenue of it, actually exploring the subtle the subtle ways the body stores trauma, fostering a sense of wholeness and connection for the individual. Furthermore, when we look at spiritual practices, they often emphasize connection to something a little bit greater outside of the individual, whether that's nature, community, a personal sense of the divine, or spirit in any kind of way that might resonate with the individual. It helps create meaning, and it helps individuals ground themselves in a way to then move through the trauma that they've experienced. And when we actually integrate both approaches, because no one approach is the best. I think when we look at healing, and especially in the context of trauma, it has to be your personal, unique experience that feels very aligned with what you need at the time that you need it. You may start with a particular therapy and it works for a little while, but it might not for a particular reason. And that's absolutely okay. We want to normalize that it's okay to explore different therapies at different stages of your healing journey. So when we actually try to integrate both, a holistic roadmap to healing really integrates the best of both worlds. So clinical approaches can provide structure and evidence-based tools, whereas spiritual somatic practices really nurture the emotional and physical dimensions of healing. And when we connect them both, they create a comprehensive framework for growth and recovery for someone who has had a trauma history.
It's like the late and great Alan Watts says, there's wiggly and prickly people, and the wiggly types tend to aim towards a more intuitive approach, which is probably the Reikis. There's somatic ones, like just drop into your body, just flow, do some ecstatic dance. Then you have the more scientific, which is no, the brain is just all chemicals, and this is going to do this, and CBT is the science behind this and this and this. And I think that each of those on the opposite side, much like the shadow that Carl Jung put forward, has something to learn from the other side, and that there's benefits to both.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, you know, that the practices that you mention and the philosophies you mention, they're the cornerstones of the work that we do. So if anyone is interested, go look up those very pivotal individuals in working with trauma. I think that's paramount to everyone's own knowledge base and awareness, because that's where when we actually look at any form of trauma healing, that's where our initial stages need to commence from. It's building awareness, building a strength of through education, because we don't know what we don't know. And a lot of the time I have clients coming through the doors and they may have previously been to therapy, and it's not to say they haven't built up a skill set or a toolbox, but if one doesn't understand on a deeper level what's going on and why it's happening, they find themselves, no matter how many tools in the toolbox someone may have, they might find themselves still engaging in maladaptive ways that only just reinforce the trauma without realizing that that's what they're doing. So yeah, no, absolutely. I think when we look at to strengthen the healing journey, I think going into what we acknowledge as building awareness, I think that is paramount to the first step of what then allows someone to feel empowered in taking some of the harder steps later in their trauma journey.
And I want to touch on the process around the healing journey. But before we do that, just one last question that I want to get out of the way, so to speak. How much does health have an impact? I mean, not health as in the blend of mental or like mental as pseudo health. I mean, health as in literally the foods that we eat, the exercising, not exercising. How much does our health have an impact on how we process traumatic events and rather how we deal with our emotions?
It is very interesting that you ask this because when it's such an intricate web between our mental and physical health. When we look at our brain and our gut, like there's so much complexity around both. And when we try and help someone work through their traumas, we need to also be mindful that what came first, the chicken or the egg? Sometimes the certain traumas we've experienced create physical issues or maladaptive ways of behaving in the world to try and cope. Or sometimes what occurs is we learn those behaviors, which then sometimes create traumas. So again, there's this interconnected relationship between the two. Of course, in the perfect world, let's say I had, the most perfect client came through the door with a whole lot of trauma, and, we look at how their environment and current life behaviors impact their ability to cope. Of course, in the perfect world, we would try and get that client to better their eating habits or engage in more movement or be more conscious of their body or what they put in their body, how they treat their body. But when we actually look at uh, the reality of the situation, majority of us who have experienced any form of trauma have a disconnection to those things, and we use some of those things, like let's say what we put in our body, as coping mechanisms. And so if I'm here as a clinician trying to ask someone to change what they eat on a regular basis because that influences their ability to cope or that will stagnate their therapy, I need to also be very cautious and careful of what function that serves that client. And even though logically we know what we should be doing or how we should be treating our bodies in a physical sense, at the same time, we need to be looking on that deeper level of how is this emotionally serving someone and why is it so hard to actually let go of? And a lot of the work that we also do is looking at the safety or the behaviors we engage in to try and create control and safety that might not be serving us, and being realistic in the journey of someone through their trauma treatment, that if we are going to be asking them to let those things go, how are we building trust in the therapeutic relationships for our clients to feel like we are taking them on a path that's not going to be dangerous? And also then, how are we empowering our clients to be at a stage where they can let go of those things that then might hinder their progress? So I hope that answers your question. But I guess to follow through with that as well, if we are making decisions about, let's say, we're relying on, and I don't want to be using good or bad terminology when we discuss, let's say, food or what we put into our body. I think at any point we have access to so many things, but we do find that if our mind and our gut is impacted by what we then do to it, we do notice that trauma recovery is slower, it's a lot more challenging. But in the same breath, you fully understand why we're engaging in those things and why we are treating our body in that way. So I do want to be, considerate to people's experience, and also realize that there is obviously a reason why that's happening, and our job on the clinician side of that relationship is to really build that trust and empower the client to be ready to let go of some of the behaviors that might actually be impacting them both physically as well as mentally.
Well, I find it quite fascinating just for myself as a anecdote when I'm not feeling healthy, when I'm perhaps have a bad night of sleep or multiple nights of bad sleep or even weeks of bad sleep. In an unfortunate case in the past months, you notice straight away your view of the world becomes quite dim. And that's just sleep, right? We then have
Absolutely.
habits that trickle in. When we sleep badly, we're then more inclined to have junk food because it just seems like that's something that can help us at that point in time. And then just the whole this lack of clarity, this heaviness takes over your body, which I mean, it's obvious from my experience that the more you feel that way, the less compassion you have towards yourself, to others, to the world around you, and it's like everything becomes an inconvenience, and you're frustrated and annoyed. So I think that health is a massive, massive thing. So I guess to tie that all together, let's just run through for everyone listening what the healing journey might look like. And feel free to use an example of someone. Perhaps it could be an archetype of someone that comes into your clinic, but also people that maybe aren't going to see someone professionally, like what the journey might be for them on that quote unquote healing journey.
Mm-hmm. I think I may have mentioned this just earlier, but awareness, I personally believe, and again, this is my opinion, everyone is going to have a view of what that looks like and what feels right for them. But through my practice, I have found that initially it's being able to acknowledge and be aware that there is something we've experienced that falls under the title of trauma, whether that's your big little t or big T, and recognizing the impact that it has actually had on your life. So, whether you do that on your own through reflective practices, whether that's journaling or asking yourself questions or using friends as a sounding board, that just slowly starts to get you to connect to how you've been struggling, as well as being able to acknowledge that there might be something that you might need support with, and where, because I think, when we don't all have the answers, and being able to acknowledge, hey, I'm not doing well, life doesn't feel good, something isn't right for me here, even just those early stages of admitting that, it doesn't mean that it needs to be perfect. It's just that there's if there's something that is preventing you from feeling content, safe, functional to some level, that's where we can start to ask those big questions of, okay, well, why not? And if it's hard to do those initial awareness building stages for yourself, like I mentioned, connecting to friends or family if you have any trusted ones around, or then connecting to professionals in any way, you're going to be able to then develop this understanding of why has this happened? Why am I experiencing it in this way? And what are my barriers that are preventing me from actually doing the work myself? And sometimes with building awareness and having a little bit of education around your personal story and journey, for some of my clients, that was enough. When you connect the dots for them and really empower them with that, they run with that. And that is such a freeing and empowering experience for them. Whereas others, depending, and again, I've had individuals with uh, little T traumas and big T traumas have multiple different experiences, because, like I mentioned, not one person has the exact same outcome in their healing journey, but it's really about being able to slowly start to acknowledge that there in some way has been trauma, and if it is something that is impacting your life, creating then an awareness around it, education around it, to then slowly being able to face that in some way. And when I say face that, I don't mean replaying the trauma actively for yourself, because we don't want to flood clients in any way, but it's more so facing the fact that the trauma has created challenges
Mm,
and that there may be a healing journey to commence on. So when we actually look at if we were to look at a healing journey, it's not linear. And I want to be very clear in challenging this preconception that recovery from trauma is going to be a straight line. It
mm,
is a very winding path with setbacks, some breakthroughs, unexpected turns. So it's okay to kind of, even just in those early stages, give yourself patience and permission that the process is going to be slow. I've had certain clients that have been able to process certain traumas in a very, very contained manner. And a majority of clients like that have a very big supportive network around them. And things that are really intense and traumatic for them, they were able to do the work, the healing journey in a lot, I don't want to say quicker, but because of the safety net they had around them, I found that their time in therapy was a lot shorter compared to some clients come through the doors where they have no support systems. They have difficulty even regulating themselves. They have no idea of what's going on and why it's happening. And there's a lot of dysregulation because of the trauma they've experienced. Again, it may have been little t trauma, big T trauma, but what we find is a lot of work needs to then happen with creating safety for them in the best case possible, because sometimes going into the work of processing trauma may not be safe if people are still in environments that are going to elicit a reaction that might then reinforce the trauma and prevent effective processing for them. So I kind of want to just acknowledge that, yeah, it's going to be different, and there's no right or wrong way of looking at trauma, but it's definitely not a linear process. And I think, in that, you start to then slowly learn how to feel safe in your body again. And that might not happen for someone for a little while. And I'm not
mm,
saying you have to be stuck in therapy forever, but I'm also mindful that we want to take therapy at a pace that is suitable for each client in their experience and also the environment that they live with. So, for example, I had a client. Actually, I've had many clients that were living in the homes where their childhood traumas occurred. So, by us actually trying to empower them to get back into their body in session, and then encouraging that they do that when they are in an environment that's unsafe, that's again something we would be very cautious of to ensure we don't do that. So our when we look at the healing journey of those clients, we would ensure that their environment is safe first before we then get them back into feeling comfortable in their body. And that might take a little while, and then once we start to get to the process of body work, and because trauma is we disassociate.
yeah.
We avoid, we don't want to feel. Anytime we feel, it feels overwhelming. So a lot of the work that we do in our healing journey is then getting anyone back into the safety of their body and teaching them that they have full control of what's going on in here. But majority of clients have avoided being in their body for months after the trauma, years after the trauma. So that in itself is a very slow process where when you're asking someone to go into their body, there's a lot of beliefs and narratives that we then have to work through to help someone actually trust that being in their body is actually a safe thing. Because in the past, their body was hurt, or, their body experienced trauma. Their body doesn't feel good. Why would anyone want to spend time in that?
Mm,
So a lot of then work occurs in someone's healing journey uh, to slowly build trust, one in the therapeutic relationship, in their environments around them, and then also being able to learn how to tolerate distress in various different ways. And each therapy is going to have something different. You know, if you're doing EMDR, for example, there's a particular structure and you go straight into processing. But again, you don't go into processing without acknowledging, does this person have secure relationships? Does this person have an environment that they're going to be supported in? There's so many ethical decisions we would need to make and consider, that if you are, even without support from a clinician, when you are going to be doing any trauma healing or processing, you want to be trying to ensure that anything that is already causing you distress, trying to prioritize resetting that, or creating stability in those domains before you would then go and really sink your teeth into a trauma healing journey.
And for those who perhaps go through what I would call, or what we're calling little t trauma, and
Mm-hmm.
you often find, so specifically in the scenario of family, individuals have family they grew up with, they experience the trauma with that family, and there's often a normalization of the experience. And it could be, things from emotional abuse, even physical abuse, but it becomes normal as you get older. And like an example might be the parent was like, yeah, that was ages ago. That happened like 15 years ago. Get over it, or something like that. In the situations where someone can see very clearly that a family is causing reoccurrence of pain in a relationship, specifically, it could be, mother to daughter, mother to son, son, so on and so on. In those situations where they come and see a therapist, I mean, this is just what I observe from friends and family who've gone through this, and myself to some degrees. When you start to pull away from those relationships, people who are a part of that abusive relationship will then start to find ways to reel you back in, like, oh, like you've gone and seen a therapist now and you think you know it all, like you have no idea my experience of the situation. They become quite manipulative, or, just an example, right? In those situations, just for those listening, I just feel called to ask, what can one do, whether or not they're seeing a therapist, if they're trying to move away from these relationships, and they're even threatening, maybe in some cultures, in some families, to cut you off from the family, like if you leave now, you're no part of this family, or something like that. What would you say to these individuals who they know intuitively in their heart and in their body that they need to move away from these abusive relationships, but they know it's going to cost them everything? It can cost them the comfort of having a family there, like we'll always have your back. Family's everything. Blood is thicker than water, so to speak. Do you have any advice, thoughts, reflections for these individuals who want to heal but can't because they're attached to a friend or a family they can't get away from?
And I want to preface what I'm about to say with that clients, we try and guide clients based on what they want and what they are ready for. We don't pull people through therapy. We don't force them into anything that they're not comfortable for. We very much walk the journey alongside with clients. So if a client is coming to me, and through our work or other work, or even just their own realizations, they're coming to me and highlighting that, look, this is, unhelpful, and this is hurting me, and this is the situation. It sounds like there's a lot of coercion, guilt inducing type of communication. But there's a loyalty there, right? And it's really hard. I find with many, all of us, really, there's a loyalty to family, no matter how they have treated us in the past. And in my work personally with clients, I want to be really respectful to that. It's not, that it's an easy task to do, even though the client is so focused on, yep, this is really hurtful for me. I don't want to engage. I want to create distance. And let's say they've already started to establish boundaries and things like that. A lot of our work would be to get them to understand why they feel stuck, why there is a pull and a loyalty there. And we really try and understand, are there ways that they can have relationships with these individuals who have hurt them that align with them and their needs and values, you know? And when we, I'm going to simplify it. There's, I think, oh, I forget how many, but we'll figure it out as we talk about it. But we can either cut our, friends or family completely off and it's a very clear cut and we walk away, or we continue engaging with them in a way that we don't establish boundaries, we don't communicate, and they continue abusing us and we continue experiencing, whether it's little t or big T type of traumas. Or the other option is really establishing what type of relationship you want with them, and if the loyalty to the family is strong and they really truly want those relationships, then we do talk about communication styles. We talk about how to protect your own needs, how to get your needs met elsewhere, so you're not expecting these people to meet your needs and being really hurt, how to sit with feelings of guilt imposed by others, and to be able to shake that off to still act in ways that align and are attuned to your needs. And depending if a client is, no, I actually want to get to a point where I, put boundaries in place where I don't see them. Again, that really depends on each client. Sometimes we do need to go through the milder stages for them to build up confidence. Sometimes it is like a band-aid. It really depends on what the client actually wants to do. So I think there's so many different ways, but a lot of it is helping the client understand why they feel so stuck and why they keep being roped in. Because often when that occurs, we feel like a child again. We feel like we're 6 years old, 12 years old, and we're forced right back into that dynamic that's unhelpful or hurtful. And we are really questioning ourselves, why haven't we got the courage to, to speak up, or to not answer the phone, or to not go to family events, or to kind of, establish some secure boundaries. And I often find that it really is that a part of us gets stuck in that child mode and we haven't developed the strength, the courage, the understanding, the ability to withstand the heat from whoever it is we're trying to establish boundaries with or kind of move away from. And that's what we do in therapy to try and strengthen. Every client's or every person's going to feel a little bit different. Some clients are going to go through a grieving process and they're going to get extremely sad. Other times, it actually is really liberating. I often as well say that while this is your biological family, and let's just put it in the top context with your example that it is family ties, I often say to my clients, family should be something that is not just freely given. It should be deserved, and not everybody deserves to be called family, and we look at what it actually means to have healthy relationships and really trying to strengthen bonds in a person's life with people who do fulfill their needs, who are going to respect their boundaries or them as an individual. And the more we can connect someone with their people, whether they call them friends or, this is my new family, it's not that they ostracize their old family in any way. I don't ever want anyone to feel like we're disrespecting those bonds, but it's also starting to change the expectations of what family members are actually supposed to act like and how you're supposed to actually feel in your relationship dynamics.
Yeah, it's like, what are you consciously signing up for? You have a choice now. You didn't have a choice when younger. What are you choosing for this relationship to be now? And that's where it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, how often do you see individuals coming in who get somewhat addicted to quote unquote healing, where they get this feeling like I need to heal, like what's the next thing? Like I gotta force it out of me, and perhaps they become really rigid and maybe even intellectualized in some cases. How often do you see this, and what are some characteristics people can look for to avoid becoming obsessed with healing?
That is such a good question, and I'm laughing because I'm already thinking of clients, and if any of my clients watch this episode, they'll probably think I'm thinking of them too. So
It's also me as well in the
it's
past.
oh, we all absolutely we can very much fall into the trap of this overcompensation. Um, and again, a lot of if the early stages of our healing journey are done really well, like the education segment or phase, you yourself will be able to acknowledge that that's what you're engaging in. So if we can prevent that, great. If not, and again, majority of us don't. We think we're doing trauma work, but what we're doing is just overdoing it, intellectualizing it, or avoiding it completely, but just going through the motions to get a gold star in therapy, for example. It's yeah, that's where you'll notice that there'll be a stagnation in your healing journey. I have clients that come in to be like, I've done all this work. I'm doing all the things. Like, why am I not feeling better? That's usually the statement I find we all fall into the trap of saying at one point in our or multiple points in our journey. And that's where we actually look at, okay, well, what are we actually doing, and what how is that actually helpful for us? Because the more we avoid, and when we look at like stagnation in our journey, that could be on either side of the spectrum. On one side you've got, yeah, overdoing it and intellectualizing it, so really just staying in the cognitive framework and not going deeper into the emotions or physical sensations, which really, really keeps us stuck in our head and disconnected from our bodies. And that's where we find that you're doing all the tools and tasks, but you're actually not processing, you're not feeling, you're not allowing yourself to go deep, because there's a barrier there, right? And the barrier there might be, I don't like it, it feels yucky, I'm not going to be able to cope. Uh, I will do everything and anything instead of that. So again, we would be looking at why we're getting into that, and working with some of those fears to be able to help empower someone to step into that very vulnerable space. And a lot of the work would then be done in the therapy space, because it's all well and good to kind of say, oh, yep, these are all the tools that really work, go and do it out there, and people might. But if you're not, like, let's say from my perspective, if as a clinician I'm not doing it with them in the session room, they don't know how to pull themselves deeper into the parts of the healing, or parts of that kind of deep emotional and body kind of state we need them to be in for the healing to happen. So that's pure vulnerability, because out there, when we leave the therapist's office, what comes up? Our coping modes, right? Our shields, our
Hmm.
facades. And we kind of go back with the motions of, life and responsibilities. But when we're in that therapist space, especially if there's a rapport built with us and our clinician, we find ourselves that we're able to get to that vulnerable stage. So depending on the type of therapy that you are using with your client, you can then give specific things to help the client then go into those depths of their emotion and their vulnerability in a safe manner when they're outside of that therapy room. And there's definitely techniques to do that in each separate therapy. You might record certain things on your on your client's phone that gets them to hear your voice, but also you then do an exercise that they've already done with you in the therapy space. You then plan when they do it, how they do it, how are they going to keep themselves safe when they go really, really deep in to some of the processing or deeper work, rather than just, oh, I've done my therapy homework and therefore I should be now healed. I think we need to acknowledge that it is slow and gentle. And the other thing I want to highlight as well in all of this, and again, I'm bringing clients to mind, and my, we've all probably said this in our own therapeutic journey, but this kind of point of realization to be like, for how long am I supposed to be doing this for? It's this acknowledgement. It should be like, wait, there's no end point. What do you mean? The work I've done up until this point, like, there's more. It's trying to help clients or any one of us to acknowledge that our work on healing, never actually ends, and that's not a bad thing. We don't want our healing journey or the actual work that we do be seen as a negative experience. It's not like your typical work that you have to dread to go to. It's actually something that you're doing for your own growth and your own benefit, and the growth of self-love, the growth of strength, the growth of confidence. So I think it's that acknowledgement that you're going to have ebbs and flows in your healing journey. And on one hand, yeah, we're trying to identify when you're falling into the traps of avoidance or intellectualization, or kind of just staying in this survival mode. We're definitely working on those aspects in for each client separately, but we're then also helping clients have this realistic expectation that even though they might finish in therapy because they've done enough in, let's say, a therapeutic space with a clinician, their journey, their healing journey will continue, because as we've spoken in earlier kind of parts, when we look at life is going to always throw us curveballs, and we're always going to have a reaction, and we can take those opportunities as growth opportunities. But at first it might traumatize us, it might really require us to sit with it and process it. And if you've been able to get to a point where you can tolerate that, you can do that without then clinician support. So like I mentioned, doesn't mean that you have to be stuck in therapy forever, but it is about understanding these intricate things that stagnate your progress. Name them and know what each of these things are and what function it's serving you, and then replace it with deeper work. And a lot of it is, you got to feel it. You got to be in the body, and it's going to be icky and you're not going to like it. The thing is, you're not supposed to like it, and that's okay. But
Mm.
we become tolerant of it, and we also understand that the work that we do, even though it is icky on the other end, we cannot wait till that other end point comes, because we know that it's not going to last forever. So then we start then going deeper and deeper every single time, rather than staying up here, which is that, just doing all the things just because it's part of, homework in your therapeutic journey.
So I define healing as, this is just my definition, the ability to mostly maintain and able to come back to a regulated nervous system. What's yours?
Absolutely. For me, a healing, like an actual healing journey, yes. On top of that, I very much believe that a regulated nervous system is so important. It's an attunement to your needs and the confidence to be able to express to others what those needs are, and surround yourself with people that are willing to fulfill it.
Wow, that's beautiful. Okay, so one last part for this, and I'll be respectful of your time because I know you have to bounce pretty soon. So we spoke about awareness as part of the healing journey is the first part, and a part of that awareness, I believe, would be to seek outside help, a therapist, a psychologist, someone who can help you to heal. And again, the awareness will inform the best way to approach that, and also there's assessments and things you can do to find out the best modality, because sometimes you get caught up on CBT, is it DBT, is it ACT, and so on and so on. So you have acceptance, we then have perhaps an action from that. That's just my input. What are some of the next stages, just briefly, maybe a, 3, 4, 5, and 6 if there is, of that healing journey?
Mm.
And I know there are repeats and it's kind of like cyclical, but just kind of a guide
Yeah.
where we can go from there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, first step, definitely awareness. It's the most critical step because it acknowledges the presence and impact of your trauma in your life. And without it, it will actually, like the patterns of survival, will just continuously persist unchecked. Definitely seek professional support. And I'm not saying that you can't use first your friends or family if they are secure and stable beings in your life. Absolutely. That is definitely like a mid step that you can do. But also in the same breath, they're not going to be able to hold that amount of vulnerability and be able to also not project their own stuff on you in the room. And that's where I encourage anyone to understand that therapists are not your friends. Therapists will care for you and nurture you, but they have an ability to be able to hold all of your vulnerability and attune to your needs without them coming into that space or their history coming into that space. So that's super important. And trying to find professional support that is with trauma informed therapists and that have the expertise and the tools, and creating, I guess, a safe space for you, because you're going to be doing really, really intense work and you want to be doing it with someone that you feel you have rapport with and trust with. So seeking professional support, and it doesn't have to be the first person that you meet, right? It might be, you might get so beautifully lucky that the first person you go see has been just beautiful. Whereas some might have to then trial a few different people to feel like, oh, this one just fits me quite right. Next step, I would say, is reconnection. So trauma disconnects us from others, from our own emotions, and even from our bodies. So rebuilding those connections, whether through relationships or self-reflection or creative outlets, is very, very important. So that's the next step I would highlight. And then from there, I would be looking at practice. So healing is an ongoing process, like I mentioned earlier. Regular engagement with practices that really, really connect you with, like I said, your body, your emotions, on that deeper level is super, super important. And that's what actually creates and fosters lasting change. And through that, when we actually look at, how we can focus on, where do I start? There's so many different therapy styles. There are so many, different clinicians out there. I've actually got a few blogs on our website about, the difference between a new psychologist and a seasoned psychologist. I've also got, why it would be important to invest in your therapeutic journey and the differences between things like coaches and counselors and psychologists. So the world out there can be overwhelming, and everyone is going to feel like they're ready for something that is unique to them. And again, if you decide to go with a certain clinician for a reason and it doesn't feel right for you, that's okay. Or if you start a therapy with a clinician in any way, or a professional in any way, and it really doesn't feel right for you, speak to that clinician and ask if they can maybe apply other therapies that are going to help you with what's going on. But if I'm to say, a good clinician is going to do the awareness process with you, the education process with you. They're going to explain what therapies are specific to what you might need and most effective to what you might need. And together you both then engage in that. So you don't have to do it all alone. So even though there are going to be times where you might go through this healing journey and these steps on your own, it's okay to be like, I don't know where to start, and I'm kind of overwhelmed by that. So it's okay for someone to then help you, like I mentioned earlier, take those first steps in this journey with you. And sometimes having someone that understands and is knowledgeable and can point you in the right direction can then help. And even if they don't continue with you on your journey, they can at least be a portion in, the whole trauma journey for you. And one thing can lead to another, which then can connect you with the therapies, clinicians, or processes that actually align with what you're ready to do in your trauma healing journey.
And so for those who perhaps they can't afford to see a clinician in Australia or anywhere around the world, really, even with some of the benefits of, cashbacks and whatnot, or perhaps they just don't want to invest in that, they want to do their own way. What's some ways of doing this that you would perhaps recommend secondarily?
No, absolutely. And again, I've got a blog on the website about this as well, because again, we have such a variety of financial constraints on us. So knowing where to go for what is really important. So yes, you've got your psychologist. So let's say you do not yet feel comfortable to then seek therapy or cannot financially afford it, I would be encouraging you to connect with people's free resources, but make sure that when you are getting free resources, are they qualified? You know, are there courses or are there self-help resources on people's websites that are actually qualified that you can engage in that are either free or extremely low cost? Are there groups that are being run again that are free or extremely low cost? And majority of people, especially with now being online with literally everything, there is a lot of available to us. There are certain websites that do offer fact sheets and free resources, and again, depends on age. So you've got Headspace, which is our national youth mental health service. I used to work at Headspace, and we've got other non-for-profit organizations that you can actually go there and access a service for free. You've got community mental health services. If your trauma or mental illness is really, really impacting your life, we've got community mental health services all around Australia that again are a free service for individuals. From there, you can then also look at low cost therapy. So, for example, regional psychologists often, or I always get these mixed up. So, in country New South Wales or country in the States, regional psychologists are going to have lower fees than people in big cities, for
Hmm.
example, you know?
Hmm.
So urban, regional, and something else. I always forget.
I know what you're
um,
talking about.
but yes, but there's going to be different price points, which means with a referral from a GP, the actual gap might be a lot lower if you then see someone, for example, through telehealth, especially since we've been able to have rebates for telehealth. That's an option. The alternative is going with a psychologist who might still be in their early stages of development. So a provisional psychologist significantly has lower fees than a psychologist fully registered or even a seasoned psychologist. So there are so many different avenues that an individual can take from non-for-profit, government, or private services that do have a variety of options depending on someone's financial status and need that they require at the time.
And for those who want to do the work outside of seeing someone, and anything to do with just if they just want to do it themselves, is there like things you
Yeah.
recommend, like journaling and thing? We mentioned that already, journaling, but maybe there's some other things you want to mention?
No, absolutely. So, again, YouTube is a beautiful resource of free things, right? So is Google, so is ChatGPT. So, absolutely, journaling is a
Mm.
fantastic way of being able to start to actually ask yourself certain questions and get down to the cracks of what's going on. Even start some of the steps that we talked about in today's episode. So, absolutely, journaling is phenomenal, and that's why self-reflections is called self-reflections, because it's so important for us to self-reflect on what's going on for us to be able to develop a path moving forward. Other things would be free yoga on YouTube, free Pilates moves on YouTube. It would be reading blogs, downloading any free self-help books, and anything that you then do, whether it's yoga or mindfulness or walking in the park or getting into the ocean, whatever it is, there, do it with intention that I'm seeing what's coming up, and then bring it back to then journaling and see what comes up with you there. Talk about it with your friends and family, again, trusted people that you feel safe with. For you to then start seeing what's coming up. And at certain points, you might decide that that is enough for you. Other times, you might be like, you know what, this is actually coming up a lot and I can't work through it. Maybe that then is important to seek some support, especially if you're finding that some barriers you're unable to work through yourself.
And of course, those who want to come and work with you, where can they find you?
So, I am the founder and director, as well as principal psychologist at Self Reflections in Wollongong. Even though we are based in Wollongong, we also do provide services online.
Perfect.
So they can get in contact via our website, selfreflections.com. They can also download some free resources that we have on our website. We've got courses as well on our website. They can use telehealth services. So we actually see anyone all over the globe, which is phenomenal. It's not just in Australia. So if anyone would like to connect, I specifically work with trauma, eating disorders. I work with personality disorders as well as mood and anxiety, but I do have I want to say 9 other clinicians, and they work with a variety of different presentations. They apply with different styles in their therapy. So I think when it comes to self-reflections, we do try and cater from childhood, adolescence through to adulthood. We work with all types of therapy, schema therapy, EMDR, DBT, ACT, CBT, and so many others. And we also see all the presentations majority of us are trained to be able to see anxieties, OCD, panic, trauma, complex trauma, any personality disorders, any attachment issues, relationship issues. So I think, when we look at self-reflections, we very much can highlight that we try and cater to the community, whether that's local, national, or global.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
You are very welcome. It was an honor to spend this time with you.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Getting Mental podcast. If you like this episode, then you'll love this one here and this one here. Check them out.